to provide context on how both governments and corporations are responding to countries where religious persecution is rampant. We're joined by Ambassador Alberto Fernandez, a now retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who began his diplomatic career in 1983. He's currently Vice President of the Middle East Media Research Institute. And Nathan Estruth, former Vice President of Procter & Gamble. He has led business development and global supply teams. He currently chairs Genesis Software Innovations. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Alberto, we just heard from Nuri Turkel, who told us of the horrible treatment of a Muslim minority community in China. How has this reality impacted foreign policy?
Well, I would posit that it hasn't impacted foreign policy enough. One of the great dangers, I think, in an issue like religious persecution or religious freedom is what I call the checklist problem in foreign policy, which is for administrations, it's on the list, but it's on the list somewhere along a spectrum or a grid of many problems. And so often it gets rated to second or third or 10th or 20th or worse on that list of priority issues. We saw that very graphically recently, for example, in an exchange that occurred with former Secretary of State Kerry, where they talked to him about climate change, and he basically said climate change is more important than the genocide of the Uyghurs. So I think that's a big problem in foreign policy, is government relations, also true obviously on the economic side, almost always take priority over these issues of freedom of speech, of freedom of thought. And that's a big problem in foreign policy.
And Alberto, why is that? I mean, in other situations, the U.S. has acted more aggressively to stop human rights violations. What do you propose is the issue here?
Well, I mean, to be frank, one of the challenges is that governments, especially Western governments, have a broad range of issues that they can engage with counterparts on. So the air is sucked out of the room, based on a handful of issues. And you can't beat up or you can't confront bad actors about everything. So you pick and choose. This gives bad actors like the People's Republic of China and Iran and others the opportunity to kind of play against the West on these issues, we want certain economic things, you want certain levels of engagement. Well, there's a price, and the price is play down these issues related to human rights, play down these issues related to freedom. So what is needed is to be more aggressive, I would say more proactive and more creative in looking for ways to advance human rights and a religious freedom agenda within foreign policy.
And those creative solutions might come from the business community. Nathan, you know business. What can and should companies do in stopping human rights violations? Should the values of their suppliers affect where and how they do business?
Montse, thank you for having me. And I think the simple answer is absolutely it should. Ambassador Fernandez mentioned the checklist problem for international relations with governments. The problem we have with corporations is advancing religious freedom is not even on the checklist. We first need to make it a criteria and help corporations understand that within their values, they value their employees, they value the men and women on their supply lines and with their suppliers. But the most important way that they can do that is to actually consider where they do operate, where they place plants, how they choose suppliers. And we have a moment in time as almost every multinational country in the world is re-looking at their supply lines, supply chains at this time, and looking for building redundancy and resiliency to take into account, are we operating and choosing suppliers and plant locations in countries that advance religious freedom or that undermine it?
And Nathan, for companies, is this an issue of community where they just haven't come together to make this a priority? Is it an issue of formation? Why isn't this happening?
Companies, I think, are in a different place than governments in that they're having to work with each individual government on the ground as they advance their business goals. And so, yes, they have been largely heads down. And so first, I think it starts from a movement within companies to say we need to add religious freedom as a filter as we look at the resiliency of our supply chains. This is in our shareholders' best interest, our employees' best interest. And then, yes, it will take a coordinated approach of companies working together. And we have an example where companies have done this even in the last decade on sustainability, where they started taking into account elements within their supply chain and how it impacted local and global environments. And they have changed many things working in concert. Religious freedom needs to be that next filter, and we have the moment in time to do it right now as everyone is re-looking at supply chains.
Absolutely. Alberto, over the summer, Microsoft announced that they're working with other web giants and the United Nations on a database to block potential extremist content. But the definition of extremist seems vague. Does this give you pause?
Yes, it does. I mean, the track record of social media companies on this issue is very, how should I put it diplomatically, spotty. You see tyrants, for example, like President Xi of China, or the dictator of Iran, or the dictator of Cuba, on social media, and yet you see some, let alone American politicians or some minor person being thrown off for what seems like very, very obscure reasons. So the whole question of extremism is a very fluid question, and it gives me a great deal of concern because we've seen so much so recently how it's been abused. And by the way, it's also used as a tool by these dictatorships. I mean, what did the Chinese, when they persecute the Uyghurs, what did they say? They say, we're fighting extremism. So that's something that is very concerning.
Well, we've watched Facebook admitting that they promoted anti-Muslim violence in Myanmar. How can they be trusted to discern what is extremist and what isn't, Alberto?
I don't think companies can. I don't think social media companies can be trusted with such awesome power. I think what we've seen over the past few years is that they have too much power. And I think there needs to be some happy medium. There's a concern also about basically having government make certain decisions. And I tend to lean towards the, pro-freedom of expression side, pro-dissent side, even pro-speech that is sometimes unpleasant or bad speech. But if we're going to fight extremism in the digital realm, it has to be done with nuance and with sensitivity and intelligence, and involve not just these tech giants, these robber barons of the 21st century, but government and also stakeholders, I think, in society, in issues like religious freedom or freedom of thought or dissent.
Nathan, China's social credit system is a combination of government and business surveillance that gives citizens a score that can restrict the ability of individuals to take actions like purchase plane tickets or get a credit loan because of certain behaviors or beliefs. Are we seeing the beginnings of this in the U.S.?
Well, we certainly have examples that it looks like it could be starting, Montse, and I think it's up to every individual citizen, but also corporations and government, local, state, and federal, to push back on this. And I agree with the ambassador that the signs are concerning, and leaving it in the hands of just tech clearly is fraught with peril. There is a level of moral incoherence that we see from companies as they stay in their silos and work with individual governments. And it's one that does not match with the values that many companies purport to believe, which is human dignity, human rights, religious freedom of their employees and those of their suppliers. Yet for the quarterly results or short-term results, they're able to somehow justify it in their mind. And it's not justifiable. It's morally incoherent. And so bringing together folks to talk about this, both government and companies, I think is a very important next step to establish some of these benchmarks and embed them in supply chains to help companies become more morally coherent in how they serve their customers and delight their shareholders.
And Nathan, where might they do that?
There's a great example of that, Ambassador Brownback has graciously sponsored a group that has been meeting now. We met at the International Religious Freedom Conference that Ambassador Brownback sponsored in July in Washington, D.C. And next week, there is a follow-on conference with a number of these large companies, including some of the tech companies, saying, we do need to do something here. It's on Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, and anyone that knows someone in these companies or might be in these companies can reach out to info@1792exchange.com, 1792exchange.com, and just let them know if you would like to participate in that. It's a virtual conference, easy to join, and it's talking about these very things of how companies can start to use their supply chains to advance religious freedom.
Well, we hope that they will, and we'll take the advice from Alberto and from you, Nathan, to our viewers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Montse.